Well, hello. My name is Susan Elliott, and I'm the President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. I would like to welcome everyone from around the world joining us today for our program, Strategies in the Indo-Pacific, Voices from the Region. Today's program is the culmination of a series of 3 dialogues that the National Committee on American Foreign Policy conducted with a variety of experts and scholars from Japan and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, better known as ASEAN. During our discussions, we covered a broad range of issues which are of concern not only to the ASEAN countries, but to others around the world. Our discussions focused on regional security challenges, economic and strategic competition and cooperation, and the future of the rules-based order. We are fortunate today to be joined by a distinguished panel of experts and practitioners who will discuss how Southeast Asian economies have become increasingly a significant part of global growth. Given the rising tensions and competition between China and the United States, major powers like Japan and the US are seeking to deepen regional integration and connectivity. So our goal today is to discuss ways we, as like-minded individuals, can achieve those objectives. So I just want to briefly introduce our panel, and then I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Susan Thornton. We're very fortunate today to have Ambassador Glenn Davies, who's a former US ambassador to Thailand and who had a long and distinguished career as a Foreign Service officer and was a great colleague to Susan and me. And we also have Dr. Chu Ping Hu, who is a senior lecturer, Strategic Studies and International Relations Program from the National University of Malaysia. We also have Dr. Ken Jimbo, who's on the Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University and is also a senior research fellow at the Cannon Institute for Global Studies and the Tokyo Foundation. And finally, we have Dr. Shafia Muhibat, who is the head of the Department of International Relations of CSIS Indonesia. So I'd like to now turn it over to our moderator, Susan Thornton, who is the National Committee on American Foreign Policy's project director for our Forum on Asia-Pacific Security, and also herself had a distinguished career as a U.S. Foreign Service officer, culminating as the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and an expert on not only China and Asia, but the region. So Susan, I'll turn it over to you, and thanks again to all of you for participating in today's event.
Well, thank you so much, Susan. And again, thanks to everyone. It's very evening in Asia. It's early morning here on the East Coast of the US. And I see we have a lot of active participants joining us this morning. So I thank all of you for being with us. We at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, as Susan said, are very excited about this series that we've been able to put on to have our colleagues from Southeast Asia and also our colleagues from Japan sit together with many American experts and talk about the future of the region, and to listen actually more to the voices from the Southeast Asian nations, as Susan mentioned. This is a new program for us, but I was very excited to do it and to see so many old friends in the 3 sessions that we held before now. And we will be putting out a report on our series after our session today, so you can look forward to that. What we're going to do today is I'm going to moderate a few questions for the panel, and then I hope our participants will get ready for the last sort of half hour, 40 minutes. We'll be taking your questions, and please, when you have a question, feel free to raise it in the chat. We have our staff monitoring the chat function, and we'll try to get as many questions as we can to our participants today. And we have, as Susan mentioned, this wonderful team of experts to help us understand and talk more and go more deeply into the issues in the region. I'll just start off by noting that through the 3 sessions that we had, the closed door sessions, there's a lot of coalescing around the concerns that people have about the future of the region, but also some of the recommendations that people had for how to address some of those concerns and what kinds of strategies countries in the region are using to try to make sure that they can pursue their goals in the international system in the future. So I think one of the things that came out was this notion of middle powers in the region. How much agency do they have? What kinds of roles have they been performing? And certainly as the situation between the US and China has become more tense, talking about what kind of strategies countries are using to try to navigate those tensions, and also what other countries in the region people are looking to for leadership. Of course, the US has been pursuing an American First policy. It also has the Indo-Pacific strategy in the region that it's been working on, but there is a perception clearly in the region that the US has been pulling back a bit, and there's some concern about that. There's concern about rising US-China tensions, and there's a sense that countries in the middle need to be doing more to make sure that they can navigate the tensions and relations in the region and steer their own ship forward. So with that, I'd like to just go around to our panelists and get your assessment of how you see, you know, we have this pandemic. We were talking a little bit before we all came online. I think the pandemic is actually getting worse in the US here, but also in many places in the world, including in Asia. So we have that crisis. We have an economic crisis following from that. And we also have, as I mentioned, these rising major power tensions in the region. Can you give us, and I'll start with Dr. Chu-Ping Hu, and then we'll sort of go around, but can you give us an assessment from your perspective of kind of the current situation? How do you see you know, the situation in the region, and what kind of concerns do you have at the top of your list as far as looking out into over the next couple of years? Chu-Ping, let's go to you first.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you so much, National Committee on American Foreign Policy, for inviting me to talk about Indo-Pacific issues in this event. So from a Malaysian perspective, the immediate challenge, aside from the pandemic response, include maritime security, the South China Sea, of course, the great power competition, as Susan has mentioned, and also economy. So the US-China rivalry underlies the struggle for all of these issues that I have mentioned. So eventually there is a talk or debate about decoupling, whether it is in technology investment from US and China from one another. But however, is this realistic in face of the challenges that we are facing right now? So there were also competitive infrastructure development investment that has been offered not only by US and China, but also by Japan and South Korea. So in terms of pandemic response, so most of the country, not only in East Asia, but also around the world, struggle to divert the national resources in response to reviving economy and also to maintain a strong public health system. So apparently and coincidentally, a lot of Asian pandemic success story come from ASEAN +3 members. So most notably South Korea and also Taiwan, and in Southeast Asia, initially it was led by Vietnam. Thailand is not far behind in terms of their successful management of this pandemic. So we have seen some form of normalization of our daily life, and we have also begun to conduct meetings, events, and for my university, we are going to resume in-person teaching in the coming semester next month. So all of this show a signs of a revitalization. So I think in the next step, most of this country will focus on cooperating with countries who are also in a similar phase of recovery. So I think the first that we look at is definitely South Korea, Japan, and also China. So in this context, the United States has to be more inclusive in their Indo-Pacific strategy. So even though we used to feel that from both US and China, the pressure was for us to choose side, but as a group of smaller and middle countries, we need to rely on our ASEAN mechanism. So this is how we function as a middle power, as Susan has mentioned in the beginning of her remarks. So in that light, US not only have to recognize the significance of ASEAN mechanism and use that to build the foundation for an emerging Asian regional security architecture, because US has been overly relying on its defense alliance relations with its Asian partners. So it can actually move beyond the bilateral mechanism and invest more into the multilateral mechanism that East Asian has been relying on, and we have been successful in managing our challenges so far because of that. So I think the spirit of inclusivity is very important and should be emphasized, and this is why we should not be seen as containing or constraining China when we talk about Indo-Pacific strategy.
Great, thank you so much. I think that you raise a lot of very good points, and let's turn it now to Ken Jimbo, if you don't mind unmuting, and from the perspective of Japan, sort of how do you see things in the region at the moment?
Sure. Thank you, Susan, and thank you very much for this kind invitation. Japan has just gone through the major leadership change in past weeks, and Prime Minister Abe was a prime minister for 7 years and 8 months, was longest period of time during the modern history of Japan. And I think the achievement of Prime Minister Abe for the Japanese international presence and also for Japan's diplomacy vis-a-vis major country have been enormous. And now the new Prime Minister Suga comes in, and we're wondering what will be the Suga diplomacy in coming months and years. And basically it is not a major like a political shift through the election, so that the foundation of the Japanese politics remains to be the same. But at least what he has mentioned was to bring in the diplomatic asset which Abe administration has earned so far, and to carry on the basic agenda, and there will be a continuity rather than the changes under the Suga administration. But I would like to say that I think the Japanese diplomatic space, which Abe has cultivated so far, which is the basic kind of policy to maintain the robust US-Japan alliance, at the same time to promote the political economic relationship with China, which is a rare period of time for Japan to have the coexistence of two positive trends in major power relationship was there. But under the Suga administration, it will becoming increasingly difficult, and Japanese strategic position will be squeezed by navigating those two major power relationship. And let me explain a few why should I assess like this. And I think since 2017, and Japan has maintained a positive relation with both United States and China. And it was coincided during the time when the US perception on China became more hardline and openly declared to pursue the strategic competitions. And Japan's dual track diplomacy met the needs of Beijing and Tokyo, which Beijing sought for diversification of the regional diplomacy amid US-China tension arise. And for Tokyo, there were high demand of Japanese economic interests in China, so that Japan-China relationship brought in non-zero-sum platform in regional dynamics. For example, Japan and China has competed in the major infrastructure project in the region, as Chupin has just mentioned over past years, but it was part of competition to ask ASEAN countries to choose side between Tokyo and Beijing. But with the general agreements that we had in, since October 2018 on Japan-China, including concept of the third-party market cooperation. And there are momentum to expand joint investment projects in the wider region, so that it also provides the perception that free and open Indo-Pacific strategy and also the Belt and Road initiatives are not totally exclusive with each other, but they are interface to promote the joint project through Japan-China cooperation scheme. And I think China liked that concept for a while and became more receptive to the FOIP concept, for example. And President Xi Jinping repeatedly mentioned that the quality investments are important, transparency and the due process are also important, that are basically the basic components of the FOIP as well. And even under the G20 Osaka summit last year, China has agreed on the quality infrastructure principle, and including a data-free flow with trust in managing the digital economy. So those are, I think, the positive outcome of the Japan's dual track approach, how to navigate the major power in the region, which brought the good news to the predictable rule-based regional order. But let me finish by saying that I would just like to drop note that Japan's strategic space is being squeezed because of heightened US-China rivalry and also the growing negative perception on China by the Japanese public in general. So there are more skeptical voice in Tokyo over whether we should invite President Xi as a state guest to Japan sometime next year. It is secondly choice for Japan to fully pursue the strategic competition with China, even under the new administration. However, the place for enjoying both relations are increasingly challenged. Let me finish my initial remark with that.
And that was fantastic. And I'm so glad you mentioned the agreement between China and Japan on the infrastructure, because I watched that and thought that was such a skillful diplomatic play. It's a way of signaling to the region that actually they don't need to choose sides, but it was in a very effective way to let also countries in the region know that there was this choice and that they had alternatives. And I think that is, as you mentioned, sort of a very skillful way of doing it, and to make everybody feel that it's a positive sum. But then on the books, you actually don't have a lot of joint projects, I guess. And the other thing being pushing China toward higher standards for infrastructure in the region, which Japan has managed to do. And the sort of playing that very prominent role of leadership in the region is something that a lot of us have been very grateful to Prime Minister Abe for in the past few years, and raising the issue of the heightened squeezing as we go forward here, I think is very relevant. Why don't we go to Dr. Shafia Muibat for your perspectives on all of this, and thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me join this very interesting discussion today. Just, adding a little bit on the current state of affairs in Southeast Asia. I guess, in general, it has been mentioned that the majority of the focus is still on pandemics and how to resolve the issue. But then, it has been quite a struggle for a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, trying to juggle between domestic issues in resolving the pandemics and seeking to find solution through regional and multilateral channels. We've heard about, all the efforts through ASEAN, the series of summits, also bilateral efforts as well between, any of the Southeast Asian states and its counterparts. But states are very limited in terms of what they can invest in terms of their foreign policy in seeking to find this, solution through cooperation with other countries. And I think also we mentioned about the major power rivalry. It has, the pandemics has quote unquote increased the tension in Southeast Asia with regards to the rivalry as well. I mean, even before the pandemic, Southeast Asia has always been an arena for this rivalry. Now, with the pandemic, there continue to be, provocations from both sides. At least that's how we feel in Southeast Asia. And also, this continuous pressure to take sides between, either the US or China in so many different issues. It could be, in terms of the maritime domain that Dr. Hu has mentioned. It could be on issues such as, the monopoly or in cooperation in vaccine, for example. So, this pressure to continuously choose sides has created an added pressure for these countries, which I have mentioned at the beginning, that they're already feeling the pressure of having to juggle between domestic issues and foreign policy in this regard. And most of the countries in Southeast Asia are also feeling the struggle to find balance in engaging the two countries, on a lot of different issues. And I think, and this creates sort of like an incentive for a transactional mindsets in state interactions, which is something that that is normally regarded as something negative in Southeast Asia when you have state interactions based on transactional issues. But the current state of affairs in Southeast Asia has allowed this sort of like transactional policies to actually take place, which is something that working within the environment, like with the ASEAN, is something that is regarded as not preferred to a lot of extent. And I think also needs to be mentioned is that one important point that the pandemic has also brought about in terms of state of affairs in Southeast Asia is that it's halting a lot of important negotiations in the region. Be it dispute settlements, free trade negotiations. It's halting a lot of very important negotiations, which, some, can be sort of like managed through virtual meetings and so on, but some are completely, left on hold. We don't know when. So, and I think this creates sort of like a dangerous situation for a lot of countries involved in, different disputes when, these negotiations are put on hold, no dialogues have resumed. It creates a very dangerous position in a lot of countries, these smaller and middle powers, which rely on the completion of this negotiation in order to actually find a solution in this disputes. So I guess, that sort of like pretty much pictures the current state of affairs. Like I said, it all boils down to juggling between the need to solve the issues domestically and also the need to pay attention to a lot of regional issues, which are now complicated by a lot of the impacts from the major power rivalry. I'll stop there, Susan.
Yeah, thank you, Shafia. And I'm so glad that we're talking a lot about the pandemic, because actually I noticed in a lot of conversations we have about foreign policy, the pandemic gets left out. And I did notice that the other day, the WHO announced the Global Vaccine Alliance, 156 countries coming together to try to work on a vaccine and on the rollout of the vaccine and the distribution of it. And which two countries were both not participating in this effort? It was the US and China. So I think that sort of just foot stomps exactly what you've said, that, countries are struggling, they're trying to manage this, and they don't see either of those major powers that are engaged in this, competition in the region actually showing much leadership or participating in these multilateral fora that are a lot more popular in Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the region. Thank you so much for those perspectives. I think it gives us a very real picture of what people are grappling with. And I'm going to turn it over last to my good friend and former mentor, Ambassador Glyn Davies, to help us make sense of all of this and point us in the right direction. How are you seeing things, Glyn, from where you sit, and what are you hoping for, maybe, is a better question.
Thanks so much, Susan, and Susan Elliott, for thinking of me and including me in this conversation. For a guy who's been retired for a little bit of time, it's always nice to be asked to express opinions, and we old folks have lots of opinions. But let me just say, let me fly up to maybe 40,000 feet a little bit and talk about some first principles. No question that this is clearly an era of increased uncertainty in Southeast Asia, but also I have to remind everybody, looking at the arc of the last decades. It's an era of progress and promise, given the economic strides made over the last few generations and the relative political stability achieved by key countries, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, to name a few. Geopolitically, though, after about 70 years of relative stability, punctuated, of course, by serious conflicts that drew in the great powers, it's indeed hard to see or to foresee where Southeast Asia is headed in this multipolar world. And that's why this discussion and so many others like it are important. China, it won't surprise you to hear me say, as a former American official, is the key factor here. Beijing, it continues its accelerating economic hegemonism, its unprecedented military buildup. The globe has never seen anything quite like it. And you combine that with America's distraction right now, which happens every 4 years, but our domestic divisions are deeper now, social and political. And that does leave the broader region of Southeast Asia searching for answers about how to position itself. As for the United States, I would argue that our Indo-Pacific strategy is a net positive for Southeast Asia. Its most important strength is the bipartisan support that it enjoys. That's something a little bit remarkable, we have a president right now who has seen fit to cast into outer darkness as many of the policies of his predecessor as he can, but on this one, there remains a solid consensus across our political spectrum to maintain our strategic emphasis on Asia, and to the extent we can to match our resources to that priority. So America's commitment to prioritize its relations with the region remains strong, and we express that commitment in a number of ways. Principally, first, by respecting the sovereignty and independence of all of the region's nations. That's important. Then comes our adherence to the principle of the peaceful resolution of disputes. That hasn't changed. Third, our commitment to the region's prosperity by means of free, fair, and reciprocal trade. And finally, and above all, is our commitment to international law, including freedom of navigation and overflight. And there's a great deal of convergence, as near as I can figure out, of these American principles with ASEAN's own 2019 Indo-Pacific outlook, which calls for respect for international law, as well as inclusivity, openness, and good governance. But back to China, I want to remind everybody, and I think, you all know this, but broader publics may not, that one of the features of American presidential politics for many, many years is criticism of the PRC. It goes by the familiar term of China bashing. It's been exacerbated this year by the COVID pandemic, whose origins in Wuhan were made worse when Beijing chose in the early stages to be secretive about the outbreak, which hurt global efforts to get out in front of the disease. And of course, the United States compounded that with, I think, very bad policy choices. Add to that China's heavy-handed approach to Hong Kong, its continued unfair trade practices, its unilateral assertion of sovereignty over the South China Sea, which continues apace, and a host of other issues. And you've got quite a cocktail souring Americans on China right now. So against this backdrop of tension, no surprise that ASEAN is hedging. It's understandable, but I would submit that this moment could present an opportunity for ASEAN as well, though maybe not so easy to see it, an opportunity to further strengthen integration and reduce internal barriers and to forge stronger ties with Asia's middle power democracies, which I do agree should now step up more to play a role in helping on this. When I was serving in Bangkok recently, US-China competition and tension was always pointed to by officials of the military government to explain ASEAN's reluctance to lay out a bolder regional agenda. But I think, and I think we'll get to this in our coming conversation, I think that this presents a bit of an opportunity to ASEAN to step out and step up and perhaps do more to increase its geopolitical weight, to try to resolve some of the longstanding challenges that it has faced. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much, Glenn, for taking us up to the 50,000 foot level. And I think that's exactly a good perspective to have as we look forward past the US presidential election and on into 2021 with a little bit more, I think, hope that we can sort of put some of this acrimony and distraction behind us, work on the pandemic, work on the economic fallout from the pandemic, and try to reassert some order in the system. You know, we had, when we were having our conversations about this over the last month or so, a lot of discussions about sort of what would the role of regional actors be, you know, depending on the shape of the table going forward. And a lot of talk about asserting, as you mentioned, ASEAN, its role, trying to play more of a leadership role in the region, and what were some of the problems that were being encountered in trying to do that. There were a lot of ideas about, you know, how could ASEAN be strengthened, what other mechanisms exist in the region for coordination and effective pushing forward on sort of some of ASEAN's first principles. There was discussion of other powers in the region, the importance of, you know, for example, Australia, the importance of Japan, obviously, the importance of India coming up in the region. And I couldn't agree more with you about the US's Indo-Pacific strategy. We had quite a long conversation about implementation problems on the US side with the Indo-Pacific strategy, but I think most of us did feel that in its outline and its main sort of lines of effort, it was a sound strategy moving forward and showed a lot of continuity with past administrations. So I take those points and you know, we should reflect on that, I think, a little bit more on how we could make this Indo-Pacific strategy more effective in the future. But let's turn now a little bit to that conversation that we were all involved in over the last month about sort of the, what are the mechanisms if we're looking toward the future, and if we're seeing that maybe there's a lack of leadership or tension coming from a major power rivalry. And I do think this major power rivalry is going to continue no matter what happens in the US presidential election. And I think it's going to continue to sort of create, I mean, it's going to be a major factor in the region going forward for countries in ASEAN and elsewhere to try to navigate. What is the sort of, if you look out into the future, the role of ASEAN going forward, the role of other multilateral institutions in the region? We talked about the East Asia Summit. We talked about APEC. Many of the countries in the region are very focused on economic development, and will particularly be focused on that coming out of the pandemic. So what do you see as effective mechanisms? What should the role of the United States be in trying to shore up the efforts of those in the region who want to have more of a leadership role? And what is the role of the middle powers in the region? We also talked a lot about South Korea, because so many countries in the region now have a strategy for the Indo-Pacific or for the Southeast Asia region, and how do those strategies combine and track together? How do they reinforce each other, or how are they different? So maybe I can switch the order up a little bit. And maybe, Ken, I could come to you first for your thoughts on sort of the regional architecture, how it plays, what parts of it you think are more effective, less effective, and other thoughts you may have on that.
Well, thank you very much. From the Japanese perspective, Tokyo is aware of the hard choice that we need to take amid this dynamic shift of the balance of power. Obviously, that China's rise is the dominant factor that Japan needs to look at as a portfolio of what we can do in the region. But at the same time, we see the rise of not only China, but the rest of Asia, the ASEAN, India, Australia are on the rise to become a major player who influence the dynamic with each other. So what Japan wants to have is a stable shift of the balance of power, because the balance of power is a moving target. But those shifts can happen without the major change of the status quo by force in the region. So to achieve such goals, as Susan mentioned, we need more like architectural approaches. What kind of major power engagements, and also the architecture and institution that should play the role for this stable shift of the balance of power. But I think the initial point that I wish to emphasize is the need for the stable engagement, continuous stable engagement of the United States. And I think Washington's allies and partnership approach is the basis of the regional order, and that offer the regional partners for geostrategic perspective, deterrence and defense capacity, and also for the opportunity to develop their own diplomacy as well. So we know that whoever becomes the president after November, there will be the general trend that the United States will ask the regional players to play more roles and responsibility to shape the regional order, both in the security economic domain. But from the regional perspective, I would like to emphasize those kind of internal dynamics may only happen when the United States maintain to have a stable engagement in the region. So this is a platform prerequisite for the region to interact with each other. So that is very important. And a second, I think principle or approach that I wish to emphasize here is that I think region should avoid the decoupling concept, especially in the economic domain. And I think in terms of the strategic competition concept, I think region has been familiarized with the strategic competition in the geopolitical domain, and that has been going on for several decades. And then we have to sophisticate what kind of rule to be placed and how to avoid the actual escalation into the crisis. Those are there for a while. But economic domain is a new thing. And I think while strict rules on, for example, technology transfer, intellectual property rights, investment restriction for the security sensitive sectors, and those needs to be pursued. But I think such rules and regulations should be formed in multilateral negotiation, such as platform we have like a TPP, RCEPs, and some other negotiation. And I think what the region needs is the rule-based competition and give every seize of innovations and the competition a chance, and not simply by the decoupling way of achieving those goals as well. So these are some of the thoughts that I wish to offer, and look forward to the further interaction.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. I mean, you mentioned several of these economic free trade negotiations that are going on in the region. And of course, many in the region are very big fans of multilateralism. I think one of the things that came up in our conversation was the issue of the tension between this sort of great power competition and the pursuit of principles that underpin multilateralism in the region. And as the competition between major powers heats up, there's a tendency, or at least there was a thought that there may be a tendency to see the abandonment increasing on the part of those powers of principles underpinning the multilateral system. And we see that, of course, with China in their flouting of many of the commitments they've made in the international system and the rules, et cetera, in trade and freedom of navigation, UNCLOS, et cetera. But there was also, of course, discussion about US tendencies in this direction and how those might persist or not. I think, the multilateral equation in the region is very important. And I'd love to have Shafia, if you wouldn't mind talking to us a little bit. In our discussions, we talked a lot about the Quad. No one's really mentioned India yet, which it would be good to sort of talk about other major powers in the region, of course, but also this idea that has been around now for quite a while, going back to before the Trump administration, actually, of getting other major powers in the region to step up, play a more active role. And we've had this, the so-called Quad with US, Australia, India, and Japan. But we also talked in our discussions about, you know, a Quad minus the US might be maybe more effective at performing that function. Or could there be a middle power Quad that would act as an additional kind of emphasis or balancer in the region, or an engine of leadership even in the region? And I'd love to hear, you know, and please others, feel free to jump in at any point. We don't need to just keep going around, but we can have a discussion of this. But Shafia, why don't you give us your thoughts on that?
Sure, sure. Thank you for the question. No, I mean, regarding the Quad, I mean, speaking from an Indonesian perspective, we're definitely not a big fan of the Quad, and I think Indonesia has made that pretty clear with, you know, the initiative of having the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific as something, you know, as an alternative to ideas proposed from outside of the region on how the, you know, how the state of affairs in Indo-Pacific should be. You know, in looking at also from Southeast Asia, I mean, the way, you know, the countries conduct their sort of like the cooperation, you know, through ASEAN, you know, amidst all the criticism towards ASEAN, I mean, it is still the preferred, you know, vehicle for countries to create regionalism. You know, and the idea is indeed, you know, for ASEAN to actually be able to achieve what it wants to achieve, then it has to involve as many other, you know, powers from outside of the Southeast Asian region. And I think, you know, India, of course, you know, all the countries in the Quad are all, you know, strategic partners of ASEAN, of course. And there is, of course, the need to actually try to balance relations with all of the, you know, the countries from, you know, all the countries who are strategic partners of ASEAN. And I think, you know, this need to also diversify relations with as many countries as possible becomes sort of like an alternative rather than simply, you know, making the effort to hedge, you know, in amidst the major power rivalry. I mean, hedging is of course a strategy, but then, you know, there is also the need to diversify relations with as many countries as possible. But I think that the major problem is, at least for us in Southeast Asia, but I think this also applies to a lot of other regions in the world, there is still this dependence that a multilateral effort can only work when there is a major power involved. And I think it still applies very strongly in whatever method or whatever vehicle for multilateralism or regionalism that, you know, Southeast Asian states have had to, you know, put effort into, be it ASEAN and all the ASEAN frameworks, the ASEAN +3, the ARF, and now with the East Asia Summit. And I don't know what's going to happen with the Indo-Pacific outlook, whether or not that's going to create another architecture. But there is still this very strong dependence on a major power support for all of these efforts. So while we, you know, while Southeast Asia is, you know, starting to talk more and more about, you know, the importance of middle power and how middle power should work together, and there should be, you know, our president just had a speech at the UN yesterday when he repeatedly mentioned the word collective leadership, from, you know, and saying how middle power is important. But I think, you know, it's that's the ideal of how the regional engagement should be. But I do believe that the main problem here is that there is still a very strong dependence on a major power involvement for any of these frameworks to actually work.
Great, thanks so much for that perspective. I mean, I think one of the things, and we could talk more about India, and maybe we'll have some questions about that. I mean, one of the things that people have been watching in the context of the East Asia Summit is how and whether we can get India to be more galvanized. And I think there's been a lot of progress on that front, and India has certainly shown a lot more interest. But as far as concrete contributions, it's still a ways to go forward, I think. Chuping, I would like to ask you about something that we discussed a bit in the several sessions we had over the last month, and the feeling that in Southeast Asia they rely on the United States for the security umbrella, and that they rely on China for a lot of the economic dynamism and growth that the region is seeing. And there's this kind of dual sort of bifurcated thinking about things. I mean, we talked about how much US investment there is actually in Southeast Asia, and that it's actually more than what China has invested in Southeast Asia, but it's this persistent feeling that the US is really there for the security umbrella that I wanted to explore. And Ken just mentioned that there is a feeling in the region, and probably elsewhere too, that no matter who wins the US presidential election, that resources are going to be stretched for the US going forward, and that there's going to be an expectation of more contributions from partners to contribute to these kinds of efforts. And I just wanted to sort of ask you about, how does the region see the US role going forward? What is we talked about this feeling that you're sort of squeezed by the tension, but what about that issue of sort of powers stepping up to perform some of these security functions, and how does that factor into your thinking about the US-China picture going forward?
Yeah, thank you. So this is quite a tough question to tackle, so I will try. Taking off from where Shafia has left at the end of her remarks, is that so the emphasis on why certain ASEAN initiatives could only work only when there is a major power participation is because ASEAN is lack of resources, investment, even among themselves. So this is why when Japan and South Korea, they have this initiative introduced to engage and invest in Southeast Asia, they are very much welcome. And the ASEAN Plus mechanism has worked very well for the ASEAN countries in terms of establishing working and functional cooperation relations with our Plus or dialogue partners. For instance, I saw that among our audience, there is a New Zealander. Thank you for staying up so late to join this event. So New Zealand is the first country to establish this cybersecurity working group with ASEAN. So something that we need fervently, but no other major power has expressed obvious interest in investing in it. And New Zealand is the first one to step in. And in terms of maritime security, you would think that US or China would invest in it. And the current chair on the working group on maritime cooperation is actually chaired by South Korea. So in the least aspect of things, in a very low profile way, so ASEAN has been moving forward cooperation with different sets of major powers in the ASEAN Plus mechanism. And I think the ASEAN Plus mechanism can be utilized in a more effective way if US can recognize the functional and the ASEAN centrality of the idea, not just a rhetoric one or the criticism that the others has always yielded towards ASEAN about the rhetoric nature, but actually we should look at the functional nature of some of the ASEAN mechanism. So for instance, the ASEAN Defense Minister Meeting Plus is a non-binding mechanism, but it is this mechanism that sprung out the most number of functional and physical cooperation among not only intra-ASEAN, but also ASEAN with partner countries. So we have ASEAN-China maritime exercises, ASEAN-US maritime exercises. Hedging sometimes is being seen as a negative move by the major powers especially, but hedging is actually a choice, a careful alignment by the smaller or middle powers in order for us to maximize the benefit, to maximize our gain while minimizing risk, especially during period of high tension. So there are other areas that we have not been talking about extensively, which is about, Professor Jimbo has mentioned about it is not good to decouple economically, but over the pandemic, we have seen the move of semiconductor industry from out of China to Southeast Asia. So even last year, before the pandemic began, we have already seen, because of US-China trade war, some of the Japan and Korea-related chain of company begin to move their investment and also supply chain to Southeast Asia as well. And this is why there are some preliminary study that says Southeast Asian countries such as Vietnam and Malaysia actually benefited a lot from the so-called trade war. But we actually hope to see there is some mechanism that put everyone in place. And this include like the TPP arrangement and also the RCEP. And unfortunately, India is not mentioned a lot because they choose to pull out from the RCEP negotiation. So we really need all of the major powers to commit to some of the platform that was initiated by ASEAN so that we can work together better and more effectively and to abide by this inclusivity spirit that we have pledged.
Great. Well, that sounds very good in the abstract, that the major powers would come together and everybody would be able to use the multilateral frameworks in the region to reach decisions. But as you know, and as we discussed, it's not always that easy to galvanize consensus in the way that we would like and to tackle tough issues that some countries, you know, in the region prefer to sort of leave in a very kind of vague or non-committal way. So I think in our discussions, as I mentioned, we talked a lot about the architecture of ASEAN, the East Asia Summit, and the US joined the East Asia Summit in the Obama administration after we signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. And, you know, we've been watching now the development of the EAS, which people hoped would turn into a sort of an effective regional forum for addressing some of the tougher issues that, you know, usually do not come up at APEC, et cetera. And Glenn, I wanted to ask you, because you were around, you know, the State Department and the East Asia Bureau during this time. And if you look at the sort of structures in Southeast Asia and the architecture, I mean, there's always a lot of frustration around meetings about, you know, the agenda and being able to address hard issues and how can we move forward on some of these things. It seems to take a long time. What do you see as the positives and the still, you know, many aspirations that we have to satisfy in terms of the regional architecture? You know, we don't have a regional security organization like Europe does. And there's been a lot of lament about that, et cetera, but it doesn't really seem to be moving in that direction. But how do you see the development of sort of structures in the region, and what do you think people should be aiming at in the future in general?
Thank you, Susan. Well, look, I associate myself with everything that has been said about architecture. I mean, I think there's something that's a little bit bigger behind all of this, and I want to take us in a little bit of a different, more kind of tectonic direction based on my 3 years in Bangkok and what I saw. I mean, one can tinker with and emphasize different aspects of the architecture of engagement and action in Southeast Asia, but I think ASEAN's biggest challenge, and they're aware of it, the officials who are engaged in ASEAN, is really the kind of the disconnect that I saw between capitals and the populace of these countries. The fact that Southeast Asian young people in particular sort of don't get it. And if you're not in a capital city and you're not working on preparing for the next summit or the next international meeting, sort of the bedrock support for ASEAN as a concept, as a grouping, as an idea, I think is often lacking. Now, ASEAN has for 50 years, commendably, engaged in an effort to try to build a sense of shared community, but it's always been kind of top down. There have been many attempts to move ASEAN closer together to avoid internal conflict, which is kind of the initial impetus for ASEAN. But I think that, you know, as my hope for the region going forward, and as not somebody like you steeped in all of these recent communiques, and I haven't read them all, you guys have, I think what governments need to do, and now might be a good time, given the fact that the greater powers are engaged with each other and with an assist from the middle powers, is do more to build public support for ASEAN among private citizens, civil society, business, but in particular the young people. You know, slogans and summits, 10-point plans, bureaucratic planning meetings, these are good things, they're necessary. But I think until the people of the region set aside their cynicism as about ASEAN as something that really only the bureaucrats and capitals care about, it's hard to imagine how the region can overcome its internal divisions and build the public support to translate mandates into mandates for governments to draw closer together and resolve what divides them. Put another way, I think what's missing is this certain idea of ASEAN that goes beyond the kind of geostrategic and bureaucratic. Now, the United States of America, you all know about YSEALI. I'm not going to go on about YSEALI, the Young Southeast Asia Leaders Initiative, but this was a US initiative which quickly became owned by the young people, the tens of thousands of them around the region, who loved the fact that they could reach across national borders, talk to each other about these problems. Governments weren't central to this. It was the young people themselves. And we discovered, we American officials involved in this, and I had a number of meetings with young ASEAN, YSEALI members from all over the region, that there's a hunger for this connection between young people across national boundaries. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a personal story. Surin Pitsuwan. We all know the sainted Surin, who was such an effective Secretary General. I met him about 10 years ago when I was serving as our ambassador in Vienna at the United Nations. First thing I did when I became ambassador in Bangkok was I traveled down to Nakhon Si Thammarat, his region, to visit his school that his family had started and to reconnect with Surin. I came out to talk about the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, but our relationship went in a very different direction and became very strong. And not long before he died, tragically, people may not know, but he was interested in becoming ambassador, or not ambassador, but mayor of Bangkok. One of the things he wanted to do, and this is a fascinating idea, it's a big idea, but I would commend it to people, is he wanted to make part of his platform running for mayor of Bangkok the notion of ASEAN hosting an international Olympic Games. He was seriously into this idea. Tragically, he died, but think about it as a way to energize the young people across ASEAN in every country. Imagine if ASEAN were to put in a bid for an Olympic Games, 18, 22 years away. Imagine the vision of an ASEAN that comes together to welcome the world to ASEAN for the first time. North Asia has done Olympics, China, Japan, Korea, Australia has done Olympics, but never this region. And a 20-year period would allow the young people of ASEAN to prepare themselves for this. Imagine the Olympic torch running through Bagan or from North to South Vietnam, running through Indonesia. Imagine events occurring all around the ASEAN countries with the entire world watching. Imagine the pride that would develop among young people over that period of time, 20 years, an entire generation, in ASEAN and in their collaboration. Sadly, Surin passed away before he could run for mayor of Bangkok and take this idea forward, this notion that, you know, an opening ceremony could happen in Bangkok, and, you know, the marathon could be run in Malaysia, boxing in Vietnam, all this stuff. That all went away. Now, I say all this stuff, I relate all this, not only because I think Surin Pitsuwan was onto something very important, but my broader hope for the people of ASEAN, setting aside these great architectural questions, which I leave to the experts. I've been out of it for a couple of years. My greater hope for the people of ASEAN, based on what I saw when I traveled outside of Bangkok to the regions of Thailand, and found very little interest or connection with ASEAN, is that a way can be found to capture the imagination and energies of the young people of ASEAN to come together. They're your greatest strength, they're your future, and whether it's something as dramatic as an Olympic bid, and I know Singapore and Malaysia have put in bids to host the Olympics before, but why not? Why not give this great hope to the young people of ASEAN? Why not give them a big idea about the region and its place in the world and their place in the grouping of 10 nations that really gives ASEAN that bottom-up energy, that future-oriented energy, rather than what I saw, which was this, these sort of endless debates about architecture and how this is going to work. Thailand was preparing to host ASEAN when I was there, and I hate to say it because I have great affection for Thailand and they've got terrific diplomats and government officials, but their only concern was avoiding what they saw as the difficulty of the previous time that they hosted the ASEAN summit. And I thought to myself, what a missed opportunity. So with apologies, Susan, for not kind of taking on your,
it's okay.
Your very good question, but I think something like this needs to be found, and take a look at this Waisili thing and take a look at the conversations these kids had when they would all get together and talk about their needs, their hopes, their desires. They're enthusiastic, but they feel shut out by capitals and by, it has to be said, bureaucrats. Give them a stake in the future of ASEAN. So sorry to take it in that direction.
No, it's okay.
But
George H.W. Bush would have called it the vision thing.
The vision,
the vision thing. Yeah.
And, it's Surin's idea. And, I don't know if there's been a greater Secretary General of ASEAN over the last 50 years. I'm sure there probably have, but I think he's regarded as one of the most visionary. And the fact that this was his, what was animating him just before he died, I thought it was a brilliant idea. So sorry to.
It reminds me, because Glenn, we've worked on things like getting the world expos put together and trying to get, and people in governments, and you're talking about sort of renewing diplomacy, and this is at the heart of it, is the people-to-people connection. And we have kind of gotten away from that and lost it. But I have to say, even working in the US government on these issues, I think Waisili was an exception. We got a lot of support for that, and that was a terrific initiative. But the US government tends to look with a lot of skepticism on a lot of these things, which is a tragic mistake. I mean, this is where you come up with the vision, where the leadership comes from, the energy, and you see the populism now, basically all around the world, but Southeast Asia has not been left out. And this disconnect between government in general and people, especially young people, and diplomacy is definitely included in that. Our diplomacy is disconnected from from the population, and we've got to get back to figuring out how to fix that. And I think ASEAN, with its multiple alphabet soup of things, has a particular challenge probably with this. But you got a really huge and energetic and dynamic young population, so there's a lot of opportunities there, and I completely.
It's one of the strengths, and if I could, Susan, super quickly, because I know the other aspect of this was to talk about the middle powers, and I did want to say a quick word
Sure.
about that, and I understand why that middle power term is used as a sort of a catch-all, but I think it's a kind of a one-dimensional term, and I think it's inadequate to describe
Right.
the key roles that Japan, Korea, India, and Australia play and could play. These nations are real powerhouses in Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
Economically, increasingly militarily, they wield tremendous geostrategic influence and soft power. They're all vibrant democracies. They serve as strong examples of how democracy and capitalism can reinforce each other. So my humble, quick recommendations are, for the way forward, it would be great if Japan and the ROK could continue to work on and make progress to lift themselves out beyond the kind of tit for tat difficulties that they've had. India, like Japan and the ROK, a great example for Southeast Asia of how they overcame tremendous geopolitical and economic challenges to make themselves into a 21st century success story. Australia punches far above its demographic weight and is singularly active in Southeast Asia. I saw it. So I think the four nations are already playing their appropriate roles as stabilizing examples. And I think all four could concert with each other even more deliberately, since they all have the same strong interest that I think the ASEANs do in keeping sea lanes free and open.
Yeah.
During China's Belt and Road Initiative doesn't allow Beijing to further economically colonize the countries of Southeast Asia, and in promoting ASEAN integration. So I just wanted to say that.
Great. No, thank you. We are, amazingly, we have gone even beyond the time when I wanted to start looking at the questions from the audience. So I think we do want to take questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise it in the chat function, and we will try to maybe combine a number of questions to make sure that we get to all of them. But I definitely want to take up the issue that you alluded to there at the end, Glenn, which has to do with the, China's economic inroads in the region, and to what extent is this something that our colleagues in Southeast Asia have been concerned about, and how do they see the developments in the sort of infrastructure, it's not really a competition, but developments in the region. We know that Japan has done a lot in infrastructure development in Southeast Asia. It doesn't often get as much recognition or mention as the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, but there's also this new thought about pushing a higher standards infrastructure in the region, quality infrastructure projects. Many of the countries in the region have been looking at that, and I'd like to hear from Shafia and from Chuping how you see, what has the development of this kind of economic big infrastructure investment, how has it played out in Southeast Asia? And what of also Glenn mentioned the divisions in ASEAN. We talked a lot about that too in the course of our past discussions, between mainland Southeast Asia and maritime Southeast Asia, and the infrastructure development differences there. So maybe Chuping, would you mind taking that question on, and then we'll go to Shafia, just quickly, not too long. Thanks.
So I think in terms of infrastructure investment, so the pandemic is also testing whether the companies can withstand the test. So there is this preliminary finding from my friends who did study on the Chinese companies' investment in Southeast Asia. So the early conclusion is that the Chinese companies may not be as stable, as strong as we think they are. So some of the companies, for instance, have already pulled out from Malaysia because under the lockdown conditions, the workers are not allowed to build, to conduct their constructions project. So due to the lack of projects, so they have to close shop and leave. So in this way, I think in Indonesia, there is a lot of infrastructure investment and construction still ongoing. So I think this is the area where a lot of other major powers can definitely pay attention to and put effort into, especially from the United States. There is this, the Blue Dot Network. So we are still hoping to hear more what are the plans. And by converging US initiative with other partners such as Japan and South Korea, it would actually not only in terms of realizing the converging interests, but also reaping the benefits for the region as a whole.
Great, thanks. And Shafia, do you have thoughts? Because of course, Indonesia has been a focal point of a lot of this infrastructure investment.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in terms of, all this, the BRI projects, from China, I mean, it's still a big deal here, but it's not as huge as an issue as it was maybe about 5 years ago, when there were really high expectations and criticisms at the same time, with regards to this flow of set investment from China. But now I think the opinions are a lot more balanced in terms of people are realistically assessing to what extent these projects are becoming reality. And at the same time, it really doesn't replace the existing investment coming in from Japan, for example. Japan is still, in terms of infrastructure, is still our top investor in a lot of infrastructure projects. So I think people's opinions and assessment towards these projects have a lot more balanced these days compared to 5 years ago.
Great, thanks. That's very helpful. I want to turn to Ken. There are a couple of questions coming in, indicating skepticism about the international rules-based order and China's evolution within the region toward a point where it would be, the region would find it sort of more or less possible to coexist with the Chinese system, particularly in the economy. And I think, Japan's been having to grapple with this question directly for a long time. But do you see a possibility of, evolution in the Chinese system towards something that looks more like the sort of international rules-based system, protection of intellectual property rights, et cetera? Or what is Japan's strategy for sort of approaching the possibilities there?
Yeah, it's a tough period of time because 20 years ago, that when Premier Zhu Longji, came in as a leadership, and his main agenda was how to reform the public sector in China and way towards liberalization, and that was the way that to maintain the vibrant status of the competitive Chinese economy. But the time goes on. There's a new kind of structure coming in that the state capitalism can play even bigger role in the international investment, backed up by the sovereign wealth fund, where state plays a huge role in the international competition. And that actually led to the status where state involved in the markets and how those kind of funds can be mobilized through the ever vibrant public-private partnership. And that actually changed the whole games of the international relationship. And we actually came to the point where liberalization agenda, where people will take off from those kind of state capitalism system to finally eventually absorbed into the international competitive economic order. Has now become obsolete. And I think that even the G7, those liberal economy countries are now becoming more internally oriented to compete with those emerging power who don't really even have the agenda of the liberalizing both political and economic status. So it's a whole different ball game going on. And how we can really, navigate the economic order in those very rough period of time is a fundamental agenda that we face. But I think it is quite important to look at the long-term effect. For example, China has done a lot of like investments in the third markets, infrastructure projects, but now they are facing with finance problems, quality investment issues are there, and the sustainable development, and how they can really get in the longer term. And then now learning the processes, how those kind of transparency and also quality management of the projects are so important to sustain their investment behavior. And then, they came back to the Japanese experience in Southeast Asia, as Professor Hu mentioned, that there has been more like a residential power, that they operate those factories and the function of the economy rather in the longer term to get the better gains in the coming years. And those kind of practical kind of evaluation of the investment and trade behavior could be I think beneficial to the Chinese mindset. What could be the more smart way to invest and how to navigate the economic system in the transaction with leading economy like G7. So I'm not a fan of framing as a kind of two completely different systems competing with each other, because eventually we're looking at the benefits and we are looking at the development schemes, and there's a huge kind of development and infrastructure needs in the emerging economy. We are all looking at the same problem, but through the different approaches. And so I think there are so many interfaces that so-called the FOIP Blue Dot Network approaches versus the Belt and Road Initiative, because there are common platforms of the recipient who wish to develop themselves, who wish to kind of stabilize their political through those developments. And I think there should be a room for the cooperation rather than competition or the conflict on those economic engagement in the region.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ken, for that. It's my sense that those in the region are hoping that that is the case, that the cooperation is possible. I do want to come to Shafia and to Chuping at the end to also give us your thoughts on sort of what you hope for from the international community, the international system, in terms of China's future development, and what do you think is possible and what do you worry about? We've had a couple of questioners ask about recent developments with respect to Taiwan and Hong Kong, which are kind of two examples of many examples we could raise about worrisome behavior on the part of China. And so I'd just like to hear a little bit from both of you about your thinking about China in the region. But first I want to go to Glyn, because we have a lot of people wanting to know if you were ever charged with lèse majesté in Thailand, and what is your thinking about what the future of that particular set of circumstances in Thailand should be?
Sure. Well, I was shortly after arriving, I was brought up on charges of royal insult, lèse majesté, which is a felony charge, because under instructions, I made the public point of American concern for the increasing sentences that were being handed out to people around the kingdom for pressing like on Facebook on comments that were deemed critical of the monarchy. What's interesting is what's happening now, which is that students by the tens of thousands are protesting peacefully to try to make the point that the monarchy should not be quite so unfettered from the law. And lèse majesté, this issue, has become one of the centerpieces of it. And it's interesting to watch how the establishment in Bangkok is dealing with it, so far allowing the protests to go forward while trying to keep them in bounds, but at the same time signaling their disgruntlement with the fact that students are questioning these first principles about how society and the political system is structured. So I think it was always going to happen that this issue of royal impunity would end up being a political issue and would be taken up by, in particular, students and other young people, but actually a broad spectrum across the country. My final thought is the fervent hope that all of us who love Thailand have, that this doesn't go the way, unfortunately, some of these protest movements have gone in the past, where they have triggered a backlash and even, heaven forbid, a bloodshed. I don't think it'll go there. I hope it doesn't go there. But the same government, essentially led by retired General Prayut Chan-o-cha, is still in charge of the Thai government. So fascinating to watch what's happening. Good to see, in particular, young people trying to assert their voice in the future of their country. Disconcerting to see some of the pushback, but I believe that Chun Lik-pai, the prime minister, and other actors in the system will, in the end, keep it all in bounds and peaceful, and will find ways to move forward deliberately and carefully to help to address some of these concerns that people in the streets of Bangkok and other cities in Thailand have expressed.
Yeah. I mean, this brings up the point of that a lot of governments are having a difficult time grappling with, which is, how to deal with criticism, how to deal with people who are disaffected and fearing that their voices aren't being heard. We've seen this in Hong Kong. We see it in the US right now. And I just want to make mention and commend to our audience a couple of recent sort of articles and other attention being paid to Taiwan on this front, because Taiwan has launched a very remarkable transparency effort where they take their government websites that are unintelligible and very uninteresting to the average person and translate them into things that are readable and understandable and popularize kind of what the government's doing. There is a minister of, I think she's the digital minister, Audrey Tang, who's had open office hours, and publishes all the conversations online so people can see more what the government's doing and that it's trying. And I think, these are the kinds of efforts that governments are going to have to pursue more kind of determinedly to try to bridge this disconnect that we're seeing, which is probably brought about by a lot of, the social media platforms and the spreading of information in ways that hasn't happened before. But I think the governments are not doing a good job with grappling with this. And so I'm glad that you brought that up. And we all hope that things in Bangkok can be handled judiciously and appropriately. But let's turn first to Shafia and then to Chu-Ping for your thoughts on sort of China in the region, what worries you and what you hope for, and then we'll probably have to wind this up after that. Please, Shafia, go ahead.
Sure. I mean, what do we hope for? I mean, looking from Southeast Asia, specifically from Indonesia. I mean, multilateralism is the backbone of our, interaction in the region and globally. I mean, which is why, trends of unilateralism, which is heightened by, again, the major power rivalry, is a major concern for us. Multilateralism is also our way of making sure that rules-based order also benefit the small and middle powers. And, but what is a concern for us is that is the possible creation of, quote unquote, fake multilateralism, which is, group of states created exclusively to contain certain countries. For us, we wish to avoid a situation where, the existence of these multilateral groups turn into a platform to shift the geopolitical stance of some countries to finally take sides. So again, I mean, hedging is our only strategy at the moment, and we wish to be able to have alternatives to this strategy. But going forward, we wish that multilateralism is not replaced by any effort to actually diminish that.
Yeah, and Chu-Ping, you mentioned too, in the multilateral efforts in the region, there does seem to be in some cases a competition between China and the US, or at least multiple vectors of involvement. For example, the lower Mekong kinds of fora that have been created. I think the US announced a new Lower Mekong partnership recently. I mean, I'm curious your views on this same question about sort of the rules-based order, China, how you see it developing, and are you optimistic?
Thank you. So I think I will take the point from Glenn Davis mentioned earlier. So most of the government in Southeast Asia use a top-down approach in many of the issues that they tackle. So in this regard, I think what is very important in the Lower Mekong region and also in South China Sea and many other issues such as democracy and student protests is that we should mobilize the civil society. So there are already several established NGOs and civil societies in Lower Mekong in which they are really taking care of the welfare of the farmers and the scientists. Even when they are retired, they still remain to work in the NGO to promote the welfare of the people, and especially in terms of food security, agriculture issues. And a lot of those assistance come from USAID and also from the Swedish International Aid Agency as well. So we see a lot of this kind of bottom-up initiative and also interaction as well. And it has not been utilized fully and effectively. Another similar initiative is the human rights and democracy, human rights protection promotion, which is known as SHAPE-C, and it was funded by the Swedish agency as well. So a lot of this discussion, if we are to reach to the government, is to put pressure by the local NGOs, and this is something that other countries can help in terms of scientific and also technology know-hows, and also especially in terms of training in the legal aspect would be very important for Southeast Asia.
No, thank you for that. I think we've spent a lot of time in our discussions at Multilateral Forum talking about, you know, the need to do more in the Lower Mekong region and concerns about water issues in the region, and also concerns about inclusion and bridging divides. And so I really appreciate those thoughts on how we can do more for people in that region and bring them into the frame. And I think a lot of our conversation today has been about sort of how to, you know, mobilize support dynamism for the structures in the region and include more people. I think it was Shafia who mentioned inclusivity or Chuping, but I mean, and sort of talking to the US about that. I think it's a good watchword for our conversation today. And we hope that we can take care of the blowback against globalization and try to make globalization something that people can realize is a force for positive sort of future for all of our countries. So I want to thank, if anyone has any parting shots, now is the time to launch them. Anyone? I want to thank all of our participants so much for being with us this morning or this evening in Asia. I'll turn it back over to Susan Elliott, our president of the National Committee, to wish us well.
I just want to reiterate what Susan said. Thank you all, especially to our panelists, for a very stimulating and interesting discussion, and to our attendees for taking the time, whether it's in the evening or the morning, to spend it with us. And we're going to write a report with a summary of all our interactions, and you can watch our website. It's ncafp.org, and we will have that report up very soon. So thank you again to everyone, and have a wonderful evening or day. Bye-bye.